First of all, hello again. Thank you very much for inviting me anyway, and also the museum for hosting this and for you to come. Very happy about being here. I think I understood you said that I'm coming from Berlin, which I do. And so I'm taking the chance with this lecture because recently I published a book that provided for me opportunity to take a kind of retrospective look back on my own production and also to kind of reflect on what it probably does, such in ways of approaching content, methods, aesthetics, picture language. So this is what I'm kind of going along in this lecture. The book is called Shadow Gap, and in this lecture I will follow the logic of this publication. I will present parts of my work and projects in regard to kind of underlying correlations, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So all of the images I'm showing, like this, the projects usually have between like 16 to, 47 images. So it's a really short selection with each project I'm showing. But first I thought I'd like to give you an impression of my background as well, kind of maybe make it easier or give an insight of, how something like a work develops and where it's coming from. So I studied humanities and photography, and think also my artistic practice is still attached to both of these interests and subject matters. And since the early 90s, I'm living in Berlin, which was a time when a lot of collective strategies of self-organization and participation were pretty important. And like often in times of changes, this was also a time when a lot of possibilities and undefined spaces opened up and became available. And there were a lot of people using these spaces, which I was also part of certain groups and collectives doing that. So the city became that time an attractive spot for a lot of people with ideas and also the longing kind of to be independent in their work. And as a consequence of these circumstances, certain artistic strategies were developed and topics evolved from these living conditions, basically. And also my artistic practice was affected by these movements. Since I was active in many of these groups and projects over the years that worked with different medias, such as film, music, activism, intervention, etc. So even though I'm presenting myself as an artist and photographer at that point, all what I'm doing today is still kind of coming out of these practices and this understanding, also self-understanding. And as I said, like an important condition was the financial and idealistic independence of these activities and projects. And many of the projects dealt with the supply of production facilities, the know-how and distribution to a broader public. So it was getting out of the institutions in a way, organizing their own spaces. And this, for example, was a flyer for a music studio which was public, called 11 Days of the Didactical Song, starting 1st of May. And people could come, bring texts, music, discs, whatever, instruments, and we would help them creating music, which was, the early days of the personal computer. Hard to imagine today, but it was. So it was a time when, the means of production were able to be used by everybody, kind of. But since still the knowledge wasn't that broad, so we kind of provided the people who would know how to do it, invited the people who would use it, and who would be, able to create. And we would also distribute a lot of these things, which was music, which were films, cinema clips. We distributed to the cinemas, etc. So projects varied from public music and film studios, running a project space and a bar, which brought the rent. But also we are talking about a period of time where apartments in the eastern part of the city, at least, didn't have a telephone line, most of them, and mobile phones were just in their beginning. So a bar was also something which really created a social space, a social network, like the option to really understand what other people are doing and thinking on a regular basis. So the bar had a special social productivity as well. And we also organized exhibitions, fairs, symposiums, publications, reading groups, cinema clips, and happenings. Okay. I'm a bit ahead with my imagery. So this was part of the micro studio. So for all of these activities, of course, having spaces was crucial, because you only can create social networks and productivities if you have a space. And spaces were really available. You could basically walk into houses and say, I want this space, and you would have a contract afterwards. I mean, you probably wouldn't have a bathroom and a toilet, but you would have a space to do things. Yes, and last but not least, we produced a collective soap film format, but this is a still from. And these strategies, they had both. They had their chance and also their topic in the specific historical situation. So Berlin was a pretty ruined and marginal spot that became interesting and affordable after the reunification. So a lot of people were attracted by this potential. But also it didn't take long that these options had to be defended and argued about. But all this is history, and I kind of think it's known by the time. But so the fluidity of these living worlds and context drew our attention to questions of space, like the definition and the use of spaces and the mechanisms of powers within these structures. And as a result, I suppose for a lot of people like myself, these years did shape our views, interests, energies, and also our methods. And as said before, today I will present my photographical work, but I mention these projects for they are pretty influential for my understanding and the evolution of what I'm doing today. So this is where my kind of photographical work starts. And my work is based on a kind of sociological interest. I'm interested in models that are created within human environments to enable something like a society. In this sense, I understand the world as a representation of ideas and thoughts. How do people live together and why in the specific way they do? Photographically, I deal with the visible elements of this living environment that I analyze and try to understand in their structure and effects. By creating images, these structures and correlations become transparent and also readable, as I think. Topics can be political constructions that generate built constructions or architecture and in that way materialize themselves as an aesthetic format or a social structure that often creates dynamics and redefinitions of spaces or codes. To me, this seems especially interesting since a lot of discourses are being carried out through non-verbal and aesthetic means in particular. And I guess these processes can be seen as an expression of various power influences by purpose or governed through the collective unconsciousness. And this process to me is so crucial because these living environments influence the thinking and consciousness of the people living in them by shaping not only opinions but also emotions and identities. So the first project I'd like to show is called Assets 1 till N. And the term asset is originated in the fields of economics, but it's also used for file management systems. And the series documents the changes of the urban structure of Berlin in these days. The single images represent various aspects that are responsible for these changes. In 1989, the wall between the divided country came down, and Berlin was the center and also the topographical unit where the two different political systems were confronted. And this was like a model-like situation for the social and political developments of these years. Oops. So after the reunification and the decision to move the capital to Berlin, the 90s were a time of big changes for the city and its society. And I was interested in the relation between politics and the city. That means the intentions of political forces that would be realized in the urban spheres, also in the form of architecture and urban planning. So this is the A10 Center, so-called, which is Autobahn, wie sagt man? Highway, thank you. But has no connection to any village or town at all, which of course was like built then in the eastern part, bringing the goods to everybody, distributing. And this, for example, is the former senator for urban planning on an excursion. So this work was embedded in various public activities, as mentioned earlier, that were addressing the change of the city and its conditions and took place these days. And these activities were based on the idea that there still would be an option that we could influence the awareness and thereby the way things would develop. From today's perspective, this obviously seems pretty naive, I have to admit. An emphasis always lies in the combination of images in sequencing and the mode of presentation. So this is how this project would be shown. In this case, the single images are presented in 3 rows, and the number of columns varies depending on the wall size, but also on the place where the work is shown. So it depends also on the knowledge of the audience that can be expected. So it's not like an autonomous way of presenting, but I'm always like, if this work is presented, I'm always exchanging single images, constructing new relations between the images, because, as I said, like firstly, the audience is different and might have a different knowledge of what is seen on the images. On the other hand, of course, time is a big actor in that, because as longer the work is, in the past, the more the way the images work changes. So it depends on the knowledge of the audience and as well the character of the documentary aspect, since the meaning and perspective of these images certainly change through time. The installation creates something like a textual reading in which different aspects of urban development and theory are handled and set in relationship with each other. So the elements shown define the urban surrounding and the living environment, which means they have a key function for the perception of the urban user. They create the conditions of existence and influence the consciousness of the inhabitants. So this is an example of something like public-private partnership, maybe. And also, the being and the attitude in the city is defined by these kind of constructions. Here we see a sales exhibition of model houses, and like private houses were subsidized these days, which of course favors a certain living style and creates also certain areas in the periphery of the city. So this is basically like a political task to favor certain lifestyles, I'd say. This is something that was called itself Reclaim the Streets. It was a movement coming from London, which spread all over the place, and people made kind of spontaneous demonstrations on big kind of traffic knots in the city, basically in doing a party. And it was about starting a discourse on like who owns the city or who has the power to kind of define what the city would be and what the public space would be. This is a city furniture, street furniture. And this seems to kind of include all the criticality of urban structures. And I was doing researching a lot to find out if this is an artwork, because I thought it hardly can be like a, just like a common street furniture that somebody would design, because it's so absurd. But in the end, it wasn't an artwork. It is like a common street furniture that can be ordered and installed. So my field of work is defined on the one hand by research and the criticism of certain conditions, and on the other hand by the encounter with reality using the camera. And the way I work can be described as a field study with photographical instruments, I'd say. So practically, I begin working on something by doing extensive research on the issue and spend time analyzing it. So I use theory and research to create, I'd say, a level of prejudice and shape my mental image of circumstances I'm interested in. But the next step would always be to confront these mental images with the actual reality and detect what this reality is providing as a structure and as a narration. This means to learn from the real in the end. And the tool to do this is my perception and the camera. So subsequently, I cover the different aspects that I find important out of this kind of ping pong of theory, knowledge, encountering, wandering, and photographing by creating images in a quite documentary way, as you can see. So the next project is called Target Campaign 99, and was a collaboration with an author called Katja Eydel. And photographs as well as the interviews with people of the political and cultural opposition were taken in Belgrade in 1999, shortly after the NATO bombing in Serbia had stopped. In the exhibition context, the interviews are present as a sound collage, which provides, in this case, information on the historical context. And like in this case, I'm often interested in situations of changes and upheavals, moments in which something is disarranged and in motion. So this was the former building of the Central Committee in Belgrade. And photographically, I deal with the aesthetic levels and codes that are realized under these circumstances and play a significant role in the process of restructuring. But there are also immanent cracks and inaccuracies that drift through my work, like a subtext somehow. So this project deals with the collapse of a state and the failure of the political system. And it questions the long historical process of the cultural and political nationalization that ended in the breakdown of Yugoslavia. So my interest was the relationship between the authoritarian state and the opposition, and in what way the military intervention from the outside affected this arrangement. So the images and the interview collages reveal the shift of codes and significance with which the opposition in the country had to deal with. I mean, there wasn't much of an opposition left, but there still was. And you could say that the military intervention disempowered the autonomous political forces that were left in the country totally. And here you can see, as an example, the former French Cultural Institute that was destroyed in the first night of the bombings. But this demolition was done by the secret police and not by the angry people in the street, but the aesthetic of the act made it look like an act of vandalism. So every sign and every code against the regime that was inscribed into the urban landscape, for example, to avoid the censored medias, because there were no free medias left, basically. The West interpreted as an acceptance of the bombing, and every protest against the bombing was politically adopted by the state as being pro-regime. So this was why the opposition had no signs left. There was no voice. There was no possibility to kind of create another opinion or another public attention. And this is another example, which is called the Plus Plato at the university, and this wall was called the Wall of Truth. And it had a high symbolic value, the place, the court, for it was an informal meeting point for the demonstrations during the war times. So the municipality narrowed down the place by setting up this building fence without being their building site. And then, so the people reused the wall as a wallpaper display and put messages and news and like communication between people on the wall, which then was scraped off every night by the secret police again. So this kind of shift of use of the urban space interested me most. Another example was the concerts on the bridges that were organized spontaneously after the first bombings. Some of you might be too young maybe to remember these, but people were standing on the bridges kind of building human shields. And but on the next day, people were ordered to stay on the bridges as human shields as part of their working obligation by the state. So the tragic aspect was that under these circumstances, no form of protest survived as an autonomous political sign, and any form of protest was disempowered and corrupted in the end. In most of the projects, I'm interested in the transferability of a structure and the context. So the projects work as an example for a broader context. So this would be the situation in Belgrade in '99, but I think these are things happening in many countries where there's an intervention, a military intervention from the outside. So, things have a certain structure, have a certain mode of process that's going to happen in certain situations. And I think this is comparable. So this is an example, but it also stands for much more than its own right. And also I'm not really interested in the individuality of a single person, I have to admit, but social frameworks and rituals that kind of shape the identities of people. So with the next project, which has the title, What If I Could Be Anything, I was dealing with a very classical question, which is the relation of work and identity. And it questions the idea of alienation in the modern working world, where people have to fulfill an average of 5 different qualifications in their lifetime. And at the same time, another part of society is forced to create a way of living without any work. And to photograph this project, I chose a company with more than 500 employees and a combination of different departments, like production, development, management, administration, facility maintenance. And think about it, but there were only 10 of these companies in Berlin these days, with like 3 million inhabitants. Yeah. So the images describe a closed microcosm with its own rights and rules. And I was interested in the way the employees and their behavior is shaped through architecture, the working processes, and social standards. So it's about the relation of body and space and how one is inscribed in the other. The series can be read as a sociology in pictures. And I was also interested in this topic because it seems that the idea of work has changed and the possible loss of work is a great threat. Whereas the utopia of a work-free society seems basically lost. So the next project is kind of a really large one, which is also published on its own right, which is here. So maybe after the talk, you can also look at the publications, have a closer look. And the series was produced during a residency I had in Istanbul. And the starting point, because it was my first time in Turkey anyway, and I wasn't really sure what I could do there and about what I could work or what my interest could be. So the starting point was the historical fact that a lot of German-speaking professionals migrated to Turkey during the 30s and 40s. And this was especially important for me as it linked my work to my own cultural and historical background, because going to Turkey, and I mean, as a photographer, you're always depending on what's there, really. And the idea of doing something in this country where I had more projections coming from possibly the Turkish community in Berlin, which is, I think, the 4th largest in the world or something, didn't really promise a lot. But that was a starting point where I felt this is also important because the story of migration between these two countries is mostly known the other way around. I mean, in Turkey, people have a great knowledge of people coming from the West, like taking part in building up this country. But at least in Germany, nobody really has a clue about this way of migration. So during the research, my interest in the history of the foundation of Turkey grew. And during the process, the project widened and describes a range of aspects regarding the foundation of the Republic of Turkey, which was in 1923, and the process of modernization that followed. So this is an image where the parliament of that year staged itself in the first parliamentary building in Ankara, which was the former school, at some anniversary. And in consequence, this project is also an examination of modernism as a basis for the nation state and the installation of a science system that should constitute a new national identity, which is also, again, something which isn't only valid for the case of the state founding of Turkey, but also other, especially post-colonial situations, where you can compare a lot of strategies and outcomes, probably. So this series does not deal with the collapse of a state, but the founding of a state in the modern era. And it's about the process of inventing a nation, nearly, and the utopian potential of this process. And I was very impressed how the state and society was modified in a very progressive way in a short amount of time, which is nothing, connected to the cliché, at least I probably had, of Turkey before going there and working that project. So the process of modernization was very much directed from the top and was aiming at an intense social rearrangement. And besides this broad reformation of the political and social system, the definition of a new national identity was part of the program that should unify the country. And you could call it like an elitist revolution in a way. And because it was so powerful and also so fastly done, they felt it was important to create a positive view on these social and political changes. So the new values were mediated strongly by symbols and also by sample institutions that were founded. And both is still pretty important in the social life of the country, even more now, since everything is in a new flux. And the reforms had a really great impact on the everyday life, like the language, bringing the Latin alphabet into charge, the clothing, the religion, the law, architecture, urban planning. The electoral law for women, for example, was 12 years before France, as an example. Where am I? Yeah, so this huge social and political program had a very direct influence on ways of thinking and living and shaping new identities. And these changes concerned education, language, clothing. Many of these meant also a clear Europeanization, like Westernization. And, but also they were trying to keep up a little bit with traditions at the same time. So photographically, I was dealing with the relation between the different ideological phases since 1923 and the aesthetic surfaces of the visible world. And the project has 3 chapters. We now basically saw the first one. Not really, there's another one. Which were public holidays and official events that relate to the Turkish state identity, and also in which the values of the foundation of the Republic are presented until today. And the second chapter covers the architectural styles and episodes since 1890 that represent the social and political episodes in a quite lexical and symbolic way, and that are mostly concentrated in Ankara. For the city of Ankara was a central motive of urban planning and architecture. For the capital was moved from Istanbul to Ankara, like in, as I said, many other post-colonial countries, like Brazil, most popular probably. So first, there was the so-called first national style. Here you see an example that can be read first as a kind of re-orientalization, like going back to the roots. The Ottoman Empire was like a huge multi-ethnical, multicultural construction. And so the state of Turkey really is, as I said, an invention. It's something artificial in a way. And the Turkish culture was kind of created by definition. So the architecture and other aesthetic levels should illustrate kind of what the idea of the values and the new living styles should be. So then from 1930 to 38 probably comes the imported modernism or style cubique, which then was basically created by people who come from abroad that Atatürk kind of invited, which leads back to the initial motivation of this work, as I said. Like since the new significant buildings, especially situated in Ankara as the new capital, should represent the new ideology, also on an aesthetic level, Atatürk invited architects and specialists from Western countries to create this new and modern face of the country. So a lot of administrational, political, the parliament even, is built by foreigners who went to Turkey in a moment when modernism was kind of put in the trash can in Western Europe, as we all know. And many personalities that, for example, had their origins in the Werkbund and Bauhaus tradition at this time were forced to leave Germany during the National Socialism and the Third Reich, and they accepted the offer and migrated to Turkey. Okay. So this is the actual parliament built by Clemens Holzmeister as an example. So this is a historical process that is not very much investigated, for the attention concerning the history of migration from Western Europe is mainly focusing on moving to the West, especially to the USA. This is the Atatürk mausoleum in Ankara as well. So you also have these neoclassical aspects coming in at some point. But first you also had the so-called second national style. Like these foreigners, they also established an architectural education in universities. So when the first young Turkish architects came out of these universities and architectural studies, they said, why are all these foreigners building our crucial institutions? Now we are ready, we can create our own the face of the country, let's say. And so they created the so-called second national style that consciously turns towards local building traditions and forms, and partly in combination with, as I said, like the well-known neoclassical patterns of representation as well. that these days was used in several countries at the time when these like movements of nationalization then also came over. And so this is some example of the second national style. And so then it all ends in the international style end of the 40s, which then assumes that a good architecture is valid, for everybody, every place. And so this is like a small amount of images, as I said, like from all the chapters. The third chapter of this project deals with institutions. And these are mostly still existing institutions that were founded by Atatürk in the 40s and have a sample function, as they represent aspects of the modernization process and the identification with it. So, of course, these are a lot of educational aspects, but also like Taksim, which you all know in the meantime, I guess, as a public space was a model, because public spaces were pretty new in the idea of cities, and public spaces, something that possibly causes trouble. And like Taksim and always had the conflict that, like for a lot of years, that the religious community wanted to, build up a mosque on Taksim, which the Kemalist parties would try to protect as a public space. So it's a very symbolic way of dealing with Taksim and what it means. And of course also Taksim is where all the protests and demonstrations happened, which is a pretty symbolic aspect. So this is a class for Kurdish dancers in an adult education center in the southeast of Turkey, in Diyarbakir. And of course, Turkish, like Kurdish dances were forbidden for a long time. So this is also a very emancipational situation at that point. As you can see, I'm taking photographs in a quite documentary manner. And I like this kind of visual language because it assumes that the world could be seen that way by anybody standing at the position the photograph was taken from. And the intimacy that photography can create that way, the feeling that you as the beholder could have seen a situation yourself, is an important basis for my picture language. Another reason for using a documentary style is that, from my point of view, personally, I think the world contains everything that is kind of worth being formulated. And my approach of using photography that way is to transform the world into a stage and to uncover the underlying alliances. In consequence, I don't think I need to twist the perspective or exaggerate what I show in order to reflect and capture my perspective. So I feel there's no way to modify, stage, or use effects, since the world is an orchestration itself and the different lines of powers are active, materialize, and behave like a director anyway. So it's just a question of capturing these underlying structures, I guess. So mostly there's no real spectacle, no dominant motives in the pictures. And working with photography means to deal with politics of representation. And this means, how do you create images and what is created for the beholder by this strategy? So the process of selecting, defining the frame, combining the pictures, choosing a specific perspective provides an abstraction and sharpness that I consider to be pretty personal. So the image is like a translation based on the encounter with the real. It seems objective, but it's absolutely not. I mostly work with a detailed and narrative picture language from which I form, like in this way, a structural and in a way also political view of circumstances. The result is a mediation that provides its own level of perception and opens an alternative social and political narration. Photography as a medium offers a complex treatment of reality and its circumstances. And I, as a photographer, function as a filter and amplifier at the same time. And in this sense, the documentary image will always be a construction, and the image will never be an authentic document. In the same way as the world is a construction, and the understanding of the world is constructed as well. So here's some exhibition views. This is a group show, this is the project created for a group show at the MACBA in Barcelona. And so the final constellation of the images is developed in regard to the presentation and the organization of the exhibition space, basically. And yeah, this is a version for a group show at the MACBA in Barcelona, whereas this is a single show at the NGBK in Berlin. With which I want to show that, a work can have different ways of presentations, because I don't understand the work as a closed unit, as I said, like also in the beginning with assets. It's always changing. It's like its own source somehow. So it can be presented in one place in a certain manner and in a different place in a different manner, because it concludes in different places with a different public in a different way. And yeah, because the context of the presentation kind of redefines the meaning of the work. And this can be the relation between images, it can be a spatial situation, or it also can be kind of pages in a book that create a certain rhythm, etc. So the display of the work is not limited to the medium of the images. This means the representation of space in the picture, but it also continues in aspects concerning the images in the space, which also constitutes the way the images work. So this is always something where a lot of energy also, flows in, and I could hardly imagine somebody else putting up the work in an exhibition, for example, because it's always getting into a dialogue with the space and the kind of choreography you're building up in a space. And also a book, of course, can be treated like an exhibition space. In this case, like the book is more treated, or it has like fixed relations of image sizes, spacing, that create connections between images. But this also means in the end that images break, pages, what you see here on the left side. So the image runs around the page as in consequence. If you think about the book space in a different way and you reorganize the book space or the space of the pages, then all of a sudden it's not like I want the image be this autonomous, erratic coffee table image, in this case at least. Or here, then the text runs over the image, as an example. But yeah, you could have a look in the book space later on. And okay, next project is called, I think the translation isn't really good, but I have no other clue how to translate. In German, there's a double meaning of teilen, parting, like sharing, and communication. It's a double meaning in that, which I couldn't find anything in English, but anyway. So for this series, I photographed press conferences from different departments like culture, national and international politics, etc. Here we have the opening of the new soup kitchen at the Franciscan convent in Berlin-Pankow as an example. So the content of this project are the mass media as representatives of the public, so to say the fourth power in the state, which of course are important for their duty to guarantee the formation of opinions and freedom of opinions. And press conferences, of course, are also moments of mediation. And I was interested in the assignment and execution of information in that regard. So the series deals with the kind of embodiment of information, which is invisible by nature. You can't see information as such. But for the mediation through media, you kind of need to make it visible. You need to give it an image or visualize in the end. So I was wondering how something invisible like information is made visible and how decisions in this process are being staged. Okay. So this is a press conference after the Berlin Senate's session. And I was focusing on the rituals and the construction of the visibility that is invented. And of course, not only how it works, but also what you can read from the staging. Because representation is closely linked to the question of knowledge, and this also means power. And the process of mediation is linked to questions of hierarchy and control. And forms of this representation are closely related to social conventions, an example. And this can be seen and in this kind of highly specified setting, because this is like a theater play, actually. And you can read a lot out of this way things are mediated. An example, the involved people often seem more in the position of a background actor than a protagonist. And this can be mapped visually. And usually I'm more interested in general aspects rather than the particular of a situation or context. So the focus rather lies on circumstances in a broader sense than the special case. In the sense, I would describe these images as structural photographs. Okay. So the last project, which is, I think, on a level of content, it's pretty logic. On a level of the kind of technical approach or method of approach, it's fairly different. It's called Habitus. And it was produced in the context of an international research project called Global Prayers, Redemption and Liberation in the City. And it was a collaboration between social scientists of all kinds and artists thinking and working on religious movements in urban contexts. And I decided in this case not to travel to some faraway place, which would have been an option, and many others did also. But to deal with the Christian dress codes that are part of my cultural background again. And I was feeling that was kind of a missing link in the whole project as well. So the images for this series were taken from companies' websites selling and distributing these clothes in the World Wide Web. So I'm using found footage here. And working with found material allowed me to deal with the content, but also to widen the aspect of representation regarding the picture language that is created when transferring these sacred objects into the world of commodities. And the sequencing and arranging refers to a system of rules, uniforms, geometry, colors and shapes, their tasks, and the staginess of their use. And the references that are inherent on this formal level are linked to historical codes and have the intention also, of course, to delude the individual, like uniforms do. And they refer to aspects of gender, ritual, and performance. They deal with hierarchies and authority, the idea of agency and delegation, of course. And the arrangement and grouping of the images within the grid of the installation aims to clarify these references and features and illustrate the hermetic character of the system. So I think by using this found material and creating like this kind of matrix with sizes, with connections, or again with like gaps between images, relations between images, you can sense something about the structure of religious communities. And anytime I look at these images, I'm very touched by also, the kind of associations that come to my mind when I look at these. So, we're nearly done. In summary, I could say the question of conventions and rules runs through my work. I'm interested in the subliminal social arrangements that are hard to notice in everyday life because you're kind of blind in what you're sharing every day. And they are very hard to control as well, but they come to power rather unconsciously and still create a pretty influential reality nevertheless. So at the same time, it's about the aspect of freedom. So the question, could it be different as well? Or why is something the way it is done or created or real? And where does the power come from that it does look like this and that it creates this kind of living world? And the moment you realize the connection why something happens to be like this, there's always the question, what could be the alternative to that reality? And an example. I think I'm at the end. And thank you very much. I hope, like reading the English, you didn't miss out too much. But yeah, I'm happy to answer questions or hear your comments on that.
I just have a practical question about the last project. You were using like quite new images, I think, found footage. So how did you solve that? What do you think about the copyright issue?
I did ask. Yes, sure.
From who?
From the companies.
Oh.
So these are companies, they are producing, distributing, reselling these garments. And some of them work internationally, some of them work nationally. And no, this was, of course, I'm not interested in any law issues going on, first of all, but also I was absolutely not interested in rearranging these images without the knowledge of people providing them and making them feel I'm creating a different context or a different meaning without respecting there will happen, to be part of this or not. So there were a couple of companies also who wouldn't give me the right to publish and this, to use the images. But all of the images I'm showing, I have asked for the right to do so. So, yeah, it's a legal thing, but it's also a question of respect, I'd say, really. And so in the exhibition context, you would have the websites as sources mentioned.
And did you modify the sync?
No, I just, I made them a bit larger professionally so that you wouldn't lose too much quality because some of them are really like 9K or something. So it's really tiny, tiny things. I did that, but nothing on colors or aesthetics. It's really like the way these images are presented and represented. And yeah.
I would like to ask you about you said that many Germans architects moved to Turkey in 30s, especially those who had some relations to Bauhaus. So did you do any research, because also many Bauhaus architects moved to Tel Aviv, because very many beautiful buildings in Tel Aviv are done by German Bauhaus architects. So is there any kind of, what was the reason why some group went to Turkey and the others went to Israel? Is it like only the Jew-Christian issue, or because Turkey is a Muslim country?
To be honest, I didn't follow up the migration to Israel in particular. I could imagine that this is also, an issue of religious background at that point, and also the Turkish situation. It wasn't that Turkey was saying everybody who needs rescue, please come. They were kind of selecting who they were thinking would be influential and helpful for building up their country. So, there were not only architects, there were natural science people, there were law people, specialists from every field nearly, that Ataturk kind of invited or gave the chance. But still, there were people being rescued and people who had a new opportunity living in exile. And Bruno Taut, for example, he also died in Turkey. For his whole life, he was very connected to Turkey and was super thankful. And the first Berlin, Ernst Reuter, the first mayor of Berlin after the war, he was in exile in Turkey. Really a lot of people, and but also there were people working for the National Socialists. At some point, the war came; they didn't have any more work to do. They also went to Turkey. So there was a strange mixture. All of a sudden, there were people sitting in one boat. And also they were they had to live in one area. They couldn't move freely in the beginning. So all of a sudden there were people who were followers and followed sitting at the same place. It was a bit strange also in the end. And I did a lot of research about this situation actually, because it was also a lot of work to finding out the buildings, who built what, in what year, and who were the people who wanted the building to be done. And the moment you publish a book and you write something down, it has to be real. So, because this all of a sudden is a proof of, architectural history. So, there was a lot of archives and research done on that. And,
I would like to ask, nobody's asking, I have many questions, because it was very, very
Go on. I
I'd like
appreciate
to
it.
hear your opinion, because you have been documenting and researching these two projects. That one was Belgrade in Serbia, former Yugoslavia, Serbia, where the NATO bombings occurred, and this kind of sort of propaganda that was done. These examples were great. So what is your opinion? How do you feel today's propaganda because of the war in Ukraine? And then on the other hand, because you have a lot of documentations of the press conferences, if you think the Russian press conferences today is how it's like theater, scenography, very, very much like PR, organized super events, like a superstar is appearing. So how do you feel as a photographer, these two questions, Because I think that in the West, my opinion is that the Western countries are very much behind on realizing the power of these kind of events. At least I think in Finland we are very modest in a way.
Well, I know, I don't feel I could answer every historical situation or judge every historical situation or something, because I'm not a historian, first of all. What I do, or what I kind of found out that I do this, because many of the things I'm saying is really, that came clear to me in retrospective, not really by doing the projects, realizing what I'm kind of doing, my strategies, etc. But I think, as I said, it's important for me that every one of these projects has a quality that is valid for a lot of other circumstances. So doing something about rituals, public holidays, I think, many countries have this kind of use of public holidays, of ritualizing, of using traditions, of the idea of national identities and how to mediate them, how to make them positive, how to make people identify with their national identity and what this is and could be. And if you look at like the election process in the US, in sense of staging, and if you then look at the economics behind it, who is on TV and who owns the TV? I mean, where is the separation in the end? If you look, Italy, for example, like media, politics, there's no difference anymore. So I think it's important to understand this and to look closely and not be blinded by these kind of, as you say, like PR and installations. And it doesn't really matter if it's like Berlin locally or the US or, everybody's kind of using these tools. And it's power. It's about power. Mechanisms of power and public opinion, and realizing this connection, and then you start reading these things differently, I'd say. And probably, this kind of helps giving an awareness. Does that kind of answer?
Well, sort of, but not exactly what I would what was my idea, because you are German, then, so I'm very much interested, because you are German, you are from Berlin, and I have seen your pictures, because now we are, in 2 days or 3 days, we are having the Victory Day, and there will be a huge performance in Moscow. And then we have these bikers who are biking to it's kind of a visual propaganda, like a setup of doing things, and to me at least it has been a big surprise sort of how this kind of communication and propaganda, how it affects on people's minds. You are doing it a very subtle way, I think, and this is why I think that you have went into a very deep into it, because it's sort of so personal. Like you said that you are photographing that it is a very intimate situation, like that anybody could then go there. Like this, I like the picture, for example, with this dancing situation, that I could very much identify myself standing there.
I mean, this has a lot to do with the style. And I also wanted to make clear that using this documentary style has nothing to do with objectivity or something. It gives you the feeling of you can transfer the experience from someone who takes the photograph to someone who looks at the photographs. But it doesn't make it objective.
I was trying to figure out, since you're using that documentary style in a certain way to where it loses its kind of nature of it being the truth, the singular truth. But then again, it also creates that authoritative distance of, okay, this is something happened and I was there. How do you think that relationship might work with the audience?
What do you think?
No, I was just wondering, like, from your point of view, you kind of portray something while the documentary style in its historical perspective is portraying something else, and how that might play into the viewer's perspective of what they're looking at.
In a way, I mean, it's a hard question because it's a very tiny little shift sometimes that makes a difference. I think for me it's important to be subtle enough so that the viewer has a kind of freedom to follow, that the viewer is not overwhelmed massively by a statement, but on the other hand, not being senseless. So I try to give an orientation, but I also want the viewer to reconstruct what I give, what I provide. So as an attempt not to use this kind of powerful medium in a wrong way, or in a too polemic way, too strong way. And I find this difficult, really. And also, I think what I realize is, I mean, all these images, except like the last ones, they are photographed analog, medium format, very classical, and which I still very much like to work like this, because it slows you down, and it makes you more aware of what you're doing, like the decision you're making. But I think the way digital media turns into lives, the perception changes. I think the perception of the viewers changes a lot, and I'm not sure where this is leading to. So I think the images work in a different way, but it's more a question I have myself a bit. Yeah. It's different. Like the Belgrade series, which is published as a book where interviews and images, because also it was a collaboration with somebody writing. But in the exhibition, then I produced like these 2 sound collages from the interviews, original voices, and edited them so that they would have like a closed text form with 2 subject matters, like historical or like development of the nationalization on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was more about like the political circumstances and the city structures, because this is a project where there are a lot of background you can't expect people to know. So I felt this is kind of important to have this background. But it's not a level of text really, but it's like people talking about their circumstances. So, and usually I really try not to work with any text, because even though, of course, I can talk a lot about images and about why I chose certain images and why I went there taking images. But I think maybe it's like music also. You can't control what somebody is really perceiving of an image. And I don't really want to control. I'm offering something. And of course, knowledge gives you another opportunity of understanding certain codes and signs and shapes and colors and whatever. But I can't control the knowledge that the people have. And I wouldn't say the image only works if you have that knowledge. And that's maybe pretty important, because I think that the images, or that's the way I choose them, I select them, still have a quality as an image that give you a certain idea, feeling, construction of perspective. So there is some knowledge that could be textualized, but I think it's not necessary. I mean, for example, in the publication with this project in Turkey, there's I only have the captions, and the captions, the places where the captions are inserted are crucial to episodes, so they give you content. So the connection between these captions is a certain historical whatever frame or something, time frame. But still, it only says what is the building, who's the architect, when it is built, and where it is built. So this gives you the opportunity to read something like to read what is seen in the images as a text. It gives you information, but it doesn't explain it. Of course, I mean, there are also texts in the book. So it's more like a reference system. So the whole book gives you a reference system of what are connections between the images regarding their meaning, regarding their origin, regarding whatever. And so the whole book has this horizontal layout, which, as I said, then also produces something like this, that an image starts here, goes over, and then the image is behind the text. Actually, I think of the images as text. I really think of images as text, as something textual reading, and which also made me work with footnotes. I call them footnotes. At the end of the chapters, you would have like black and white small images that would have the same index number with an I in front to the big ones. So there's a reference system within the images as well. So you can actually read them, but you can also just look at them and, sense them or whatever. So, I don't really trust in text. Of course I do. I mean, that's not the point, but I'm not working with text. I'm working with images. And I like to believe that I trust in images. As a medium, of course, not as a truth. I think we'll be around a couple of minutes if something comes up. Please. Thank you very much.